We're going to talk about some things that just don't add up. Here we've been, at this COVID-19 pandemic for now, this lockdown for a pretty good while. And I know many of you are frustrated and many of you are probably curious as to why we're still in a lockdown. So what I wanted to do tonight is just kind of walk you through a timeline, because there's some questions I think we all need to be asking at this point. Some clarity that we haven't really gotten, some lack of honesty and lack of we'll just say lack of pulling back the curtain from the powers that be, from the governors, from the governments, and from the politicians, as well as from many of the medical practitioners. So I think it's important that we start asking some serious questions, because at this point, where are we at today? In today's world in the United States, we're now seeing fathers being arrested for playing with their children in the park. We're seeing governments filling in playgrounds with sand to avoid people from playing in them. We're seeing governments close down national parks and state parks and county parks and telling people to shelter in place and go inside and not associate with other people and not approximate with other people at all costs, regardless of the potential that, all of these actions, aside from impinging on our actual constitutional rights, at the cost of saving lives. Where you hear all these hashtags, we're in this together, let's save lives together, don't be selfish by getting out there. And a lot of this is really nonsense. In my opinion, as we view this whole ordeal as it's played out, it's becoming to look more and more like propaganda. So I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the timeline, just to get you guys to start asking different questions, to start maybe potentially looking at this a little bit differently. And if I happen to make some of you mad and you don't like what I'm going to say tonight, then just go away. We don't need your negative commentary. This is for critical thinking only. This is not me trying to insult or assault anyone. This is just me asking intelligent questions, because that's where progress occurs. So if we go backwards in time, so we say, what's fishy about this whole thing? To me, what's fishy about COVID-19 in the very beginning is it doesn't, as a virus, it's never honored Koch's postulates. So those of you who may not know what Koch's postulates are, think of these as the laws of trying to identify whether or not a microorganism actually causes an infectious disease. So initially, we have to identify the actual microorganism. So we ID the microorganism. Then we extract that microorganism from whatever was making it sick. So in this case, preferably we extract the microorganism from a human who was sick with potential disease. Then we take that microorganism and we put it into a healthy human. And if that healthy human becomes sick with the same disease, we now have evidence, scientific evidence, not conjecture, not theory, not probability, not maybe, not coincidence, not guilt by association, but direct evidence that the actual microorganism is actually the culprit. Now, what strikes me as fishy about COVID-19 is, number one, we've actually not even identified the virus itself. We've identified a fragment of the virus. Now, I'm not saying that people aren't dying from COVID. I'm not saying that people aren't getting sick. I'm just, again, asking questions. We've identified the fragment of the virus, and we've approved a test that has an extremely high false positive rate. And some scientists showing 80% false positive. And if you remember in the news, there were several batches of tests that were originally sent out that were actually contaminated with COVID-19. So, and some of the tests, again, some tests were contaminated, which is awful fishy to me, because if we're trying to create a medical test, obviously you don't contaminate it with the very thing you're trying to identify. That just, again, smells wrong, doesn't pass the sniff test. So some tests were contaminated, some were recalled, but how many possible tests were contaminated that weren't recalled? We don't know. We don't have that answer. We were just fortunate enough to catch what we did catch. So these things to me didn't really add up in the very beginning, but a lot of people let these things kind of go. Why? Because, we were trying to do the right thing to hashtag save lives, right? Do your part to save lives. But So this happened, right? We didn't honor the virus as part of, we didn't actually identify the virus. We didn't go through proper science and rigor to identify that the virus was actually the culprit and not other things, or that it wasn't other things. But then what happened beyond that is, as we tested people and there's a high degree of false positive, what that has a potential to do is inflate the numbers. And this doesn't make sense to me. Because if you inflate the numbers artificially, what you do is you create fear and panic, and you change the nature of the way people are going to behave. When you have higher numbers than what is actual, that fear leads to limbic decision making. So you're tapping into your limbic brain, and now people start making decisions not based on intelligence, not based on thought, but based on fear. And fear is a very powerful motivator. And many times, how many times can you recall when you were in a state of panic or state of fear where you made the best decisions of your life? I'm certain that if any of you were saying, yeah, I made the best decision when I was stressed to the max and in solid fear, you're probably lying to yourself. Fear creates bad decision making. And so, again, the tests inflated the numbers. And we look at Italy as the model. And this is another kind of doesn't pass the smell test. Italy as the original model, cases rapidly increased and death rates that were being reported were quite high. But after the whole thing kind of subsided, Italy comes back and says death rates, or the deaths, were projected 88% too high, meaning that they were calling everything COVID deaths, even if it wasn't a COVID death. And so we had this, again, artificial elevation potentially in the actual total quantity, but also an artificial elevation in the quantity of deaths that, have come back now and said, hey, we overestimated the quantity of deaths. Now, the rest of the world was watching this. So again, this is a timeline. So then the rest of the world, what do? They make a decision to say, let's shelter in place because we don't want to become Italy. But Italy really wasn't Italy, because what was being reported about Italy was false. So if we now know that Italy was false, but we've made policy, government policy has been put in place to shelter in place. Hey, don't forget to check out the rest of the series right here. Make sure you hit subscribe below. And as always, thanks for tuning in.